All right, thanks for sticking around. It's been a really interesting several days. So I'm going to talk from a somewhat different perspective than some of the people who've been presenting. So more from the perspective of kind of first and foremost being a clinical scientist who is interested in trying to understand why people with psychosis have difficulties with motivated behavior. And from the perspective of trying to incorporate and utilize computational approaches to try to help us understand mechanisms and eventually also how things might work differently in psychosis than they might work, for example, in depression, right? And so setting the stage there, I don't think of myself as, someone who comes to the table with a ton of computational expertise, but I think I'm fairly good at latching on to those who do and using that to try to understand effort and motivation in psychosis. So to illustrate that in ways I think that taking computational perspectives has helped us to understand what is going awry and what isn't going awry. I'm going to talk about a program of research that I and colleagues have been engaging in for a number of years to try to tease apart kind of a model and mechanisms that might be contributing to deficits in motivation and psychosis. And we're hoping that in the not so distant future that this will point to potential treatment pathways that might be more specific for psychosis versus, say, depression. So just disclosing interests and starting out by thanking a lot of the people who've been heavy collaborators on this work, in particular Michael Frank, who has worked with us on a number of the projects, and he and his graduate students have either done a lot of the modeling or helped my students and postdocs do the modeling. Jim Gold at MPRC and Angus McDonald at the University of Minnesota, Cam Carter and Dan Ragland at UC Davis. And then I want to particularly highlight these students and postdocs who have spearheaded a number of the studies that I'm going to talk about today. And I'll kind of allude to them as I go along. So we've taken as sort of a starting framework a somewhat heuristic model of the pathways between sort of experiencing something as pleasurable or enjoyable or rewarding, and sort of what are all the actions that needed, or what are all the steps, I don't want to say actions, what are all the kind of pieces of the pie that needed to be intact in order to allow you to engage in goal-directed behavior that might let you encounter those things that you find rewarding or incentivizing. And, starting kind of way back, you've got to find that thing pleasurable, right? Or rewarding or incentivizing, whatever word you want to use. And we, if we take sort of a research diagnostic criteria framework, this is akin to what's been referred to as the initial response to reward. It has been argued that some of these aspects of hedonics or liking reflect the function of opiate and GABA systems in the basal ganglia and the orbital frontal cortex. If you don't find something enjoyable, you're probably going to be less likely to exert effort and to engage in goal-directed actions to obtain that. But then you also need to be able to anticipate or predict the things that are going to bring you rewarding outcomes. Some people have referred to this as wanting. In the RDoC framework, it's reward anticipation, sometimes reward prediction error. And that is thought to be motivated in part by dopamine systems in the basal ganglia and the anterior cingulate. You've also got to learn about these actions, right, in order to be able to engage in this kind of anticipation. And there are probably both implicit, from the human perspective, less available to conscious awareness, and more explicit systems, more available to conscious awareness. The implicit systems, people have argued, involve these slow striatal learning systems, whereas it's been argued that the more explicit systems add in representation supported by anterior cingulate, orbital frontal cortex, dorsolateral PFC to kind of add on to or complement these striatal learning systems. And in RDoCs, this is kind of lumped together as reinforcement learning. But then you also have to decide how much you value a reward, right? Because how much you're going to find something valuable is not just going to depend on that thing, but also the state of the system, right? So, if you're looking at monkeys, right, how much monkey cares about this sip of juice depends on how many sips of juice it's had previously, how satiated it is, how thirsty it is. For humans, if I come in here with a big tray of chocolate chip cookies, how much you value that chocolate chip chip cookie, and whatever willingness you have to engage in behaviors to get it is going to depend on whether you've just eaten 10 chocolate chip cookies or you're starving or you're full, right? So valuation includes sort of the state of the system, what the other competitors are, those sorts of things. And you also need to decide sort of what effort is going to be needed to obtain that outcome, right? So, I'm sitting home in my house, 10 o'clock on a Friday night. I decide I really want, a chocolate chip cookie. There are none in the house. How willing am I to get up, take my pajamas off, put on my outside clothes, get in the car, go to the grocery store, right? Those are all effortful actions I would have to engage in order to get that cookie. And I have to kind of compute the effort cost and decide sort of how much I'm willing to, exert in relationship to how much I value that outcome. And disruptions in these computations could change your willingness to exert effort, your willingness to sort of generate an action plan. And should you actually decide that you want to go get these things, right, you do have to generate an action plan that gets you from here to there. Sometimes those action plans have to be maintained over short time periods, sometimes over longer time periods. You may have to maintain representations that you can use to continue to guide your behavior about future outcomes. And in the RDoC framework, that might be called action selection or preference-based decision-making. And sort of all these things have to be intact in order for you to engage in motivated behavioral responses, right? And a disruption in sort of any part of the system could lead to impairments in what we call motivated behavioral responses or amotivation. But different kinds of disruptions, right, might disturb this system in different ways, and they might kind of require different forms of intervention, right? I'm not going to talk about our comparison to depression work today, but just sort of spoiler alert, I think there's evidence to suggest that the kind of where the things break down in these pathways for depression versus psychosis are different and might really require different forms of treatment responses. So we have been trying to sort of systematically engage in research that looks at these different components of the pathway to try to understand where things are going awry. I'm not going to show you data, but I'll just assert, because I think there's just a huge amount of data in the literature about this, which is that hedonics are surprisingly intact amongst individuals with psychosis. And I say surprising because I think clinically, historically, we talk about anhedonia in psychosis. And I'm going to use the word psychosis a little bit broadly because I think this isn't just schizophrenia. I think this can include like schizoaffective disorder, more subclinical forms of psychosis as well. But we historically thought, anhedonia. When we clinically interview patients, they often report things to us that make it seem as if they are not enjoying things in their everyday life. But it turns out, if you actually measure self-reports, brain responses, physiological responses, when they're engaging or kind of receiving or experiencing things, they seem to enjoy them just fine, right? That includes money, food, drinks, social interactions, right? A lot of evidence that kind of, on average at least, people with schizophrenia are really not anhedonic in the traditional definition of the word, right? They are experiencing pleasure. And I could show you studies from my lab, studies from like 10 other labs that all show the same thing. Okay, so that does not seem to be where the location of the problem is. And I'll show you some data now that also suggests that, again, somewhat surprisingly, implicit reinforcement learning seems to be relatively intact among individuals with psychosis. Kind of getting ahead of myself here, we do have evidence for reduced reward prediction error and lots of evidence for impairments in cognitive control and explicit reinforcement learning. And I'll show you data that will hopefully convince you of that. And then I'm going to show you some data also suggesting that effort allocation is impaired and that in turn may contribute to reduced motivated behaviors. So this is sort of telling you ahead of time what I'm going to tell you, and then I'll tell you it. Okay, so what about implicit reinforcement learning? How do you measure that? There's a lot of ways you could measure it. There's a number of different tasks. We and others have used a task developed by Diego Pizzagalli that also uses a form of computational modeling, signal detection modeling to try to distinguish between different components of performance to try to understand the degree to which people are being influenced by rewards versus just having a difficult time engaging in the task. So the way this task works, it's pretty simple. You see a face, and your job is simply to say whether the mouth that you're shown is short or long. And there's an initial titration phase to get people to a pretty similar range of performance, and for it to be a difficult discrimination, right? So it's not an easy task to do. And then what's happening unbeknownst to the participant is that one of those faces, short or long, is chosen to be the rich stimulus and the other the lean stimulus. And then on a subset of trials, the participant is provided with feedback as to whether they were accurate. And that feedback is correct, 5 cents, right? They never get false feedback. It's just that they don't get feedback on every trial. They only get feedback on a subset of trials. And that feedback is differentially offered for the rich mouth versus the lean mouth, right? So you're going to get more feedback about your responses to the rich mouth than you are to the lean mouth, okay? And it is subtle enough that nobody gets this. You debrief them at the end. They don't know that there was a differential frequency of getting feedback about one type of response versus the other. But what you see in healthy populations is quite clear change in their behavior, and it's a change in the bias parameter estimate over time, where they start to show an increased bias, right? Meaning, so when they don't really know what the right answer is, they are biased to choose the response that is the one that is more frequently provided with information about reward, okay? And they do this task typically in blocks of trials, and you can start to see the bias even in the first block of trials, but in some studies that bias goes up as people have more experience in the task. But at the end, they can't tell you anything about that. They don't recognize that they had that bias, right? And D prime doesn't change, so their accuracy doesn't change across blocks, but their bias changes over time. And we're able to pull that out, using the signal detection model. So what do we see in psychosis? So this was the very first study that used this out of Jim Gold's lab at Maryland. And this is the bias estimate. The open thingies are healthy controls, and the dark gray are folks with schizophrenia. These are the 3 blocks. You can see they all have a bias towards the more rewarded or the rich mouth, but it's not different at all between patients with schizophrenia and controls, right? So in case that doesn't convince you, here's a second unpublished study that we did where we had healthy controls and patients with schizophrenia. And if anything, the patients are showing more of a bias than controls. But again, no evidence of a disruption in that. And in case you're not convinced by that, here's a third study that included bipolar patients who had psychotic symptoms, schizophrenia, and schizoaffective disorder. And again, no evidence of reduced bias, okay? So multiple studies suggesting that they are showing intact implicit reinforcement learning. So when it doesn't involve sort of explicit representation systems, they seem to be influenced by, getting more feedback about reward for one type of mouth versus another. And there have been a couple other paradigms that people have used that have seen similar results.
A lot of the models split bias-based implicit learning from essentially procedural action implicit learning. Have people also done, this looks like the bias-based.
This is the bias-based. There are procedural learning tasks too, not as many, like sequence learning in those. And the data's a little more mixed there as to the degree to which some of the studies show what looks like completely intact procedural learning, some not. It might get more complex about what medications they're on or not, because that can also affect the motor system. So that literature, I would say the procedural learning is a little less clear, whereas the more bias-based system seems to be pretty good evidence. When it's implicit, and I'm going to emphasize that over and over again, when the controls cannot bootstrap their performance through explicit representations, we don't see a lot of evidence of difference. So, okay, great. All right. My arrows are good. So in addition to hedonics, then, we have, we think, pretty good evidence that implicit reinforcement learning is intact. And I want to emphasize here, if we sort of hadn't had the ability to use like a signal detection model to split out bias and D prime, I don't know that we would have concluded this, because D prime is actually pretty impaired in these patients compared to controls, right? Like they are not as good at the task, right? But they show an equal amount of bias in response to the reinforcement that they're getting on that task, even though they're not as accurate on that task. In the interest of time, I'm not going to show you a lot of data about reward prediction, but I will show you more data on explicit reinforcement learning, because I think, again, this is a place where the modeling has helped us try to kind of figure out what's going on here. And let me start, there we go. Let me start with one of our earliest studies on this, spearheaded by a previous graduate student, Aaron Dowd, that used work out of Michael Frank's lab to try to tease apart kind of what components of reinforcement learning might be impaired. And in particular, we went into this study wanting to test the idea that what may be going wrong in psychosis is deficits in sort of prediction error responsivity, right? That maybe they experience things as rewarding, maybe, implicit reinforcement learning was okay, but when they got sort of explicit feedback that they could recognize that they were showing impairments in prediction error signaling in the striatum, and that would be contributing to difficulties like learning what to anticipate, learning what actions led to what outcomes. So we adopted a task that Michael had developed where people had a learning phase where they were presented with pairs of stimuli, and they were just simple objects like chairs and irons. And they had 3 pairs. The first pair, the AB pair, was an 80-20%. So one item came with reward 80% of the time and the other 20% of the time. Then the other pair was 70-30. And the last pair was 60-40. And this just gives you an example of what happens over the course of learning in healthy controls. They learn fairly well to match those probabilities over the course of trials, right? So they get to about 80% choosing the A over the B stimulus. They get to about 60% of the time the C, and so on. So they learn this, it's not the easiest discrimination in the world, but they learn it pretty well. We then look at what happens in the patients with schizophrenia, and what you see now, in contrast to the implicit reinforcement learning paradigms, is a pretty clear deficit in explicit reinforcement learning, right, where they're not learning at the same rate. And I should note, this task has been run in a couple different studies. It's been done where you quit after you reach a certain learning criteria, or we did it where they had to do lots and lots of trials because we were imaging them at the same time. And they never seem to get there. Even if you gave them more trials, it's not that they'll get to the same asymptote if you just keep giving them trials. They really never get to that same point in time, or at least we can't make them do the task long enough to get them to that same point in time. Okay, so this is the learning phase. And then the kind of interesting part of this study is that there's actually a transfer phase where after they do the learning phase, they then get all the pairs of stimuli that they saw in the learning phase, but they also get them all compared to each other. So they see the original AB, but they see AC, AD, AE, AF, BC, BD, B, and now they're simply told, pick whichever stimulus you think is likely to be more associated with reward, and they get no more feedback. And what you can do is look at when there's novel pairings, right? So they've never seen A with C before, they've never seen A with D before, right? What can they use to make choices on? Well, they can use their information about whether A in the past was a stimulus more likely to be associated with reward, and B, for example, was a stimulus very unlikely to be associated with reward, right? And so you can look at the frequency with which they choose A when it's paired with new stimulus, and we consider that to be a measure of learning from previous reinforcement. And you can also look at the frequency with which they do not choose B or D, for example. So you can look at A and C learning from reward, B and D, learning to avoid losing, right? And that, in theory, can be modeled separately. So we focus particularly on choosing C and avoiding D because A and B tended to be overlearned. And what you see is that we don't see a significant difference in avoiding losses between patients and controls, but what we do see is a reduction in sort of the evidence that they've learned from reward. And if you do a computational model, just a kind of very standard, Riscola-Wagner model, where you have separate parameters for gain and loss learning rates, what you see is that the alpha for learning from losses is not different between the patients and controls, but the alpha for learning from gains is reduced, right? So we are seeing evidence now of altered, reduced learning rates in the patients. It seems to be more specific to rewards than losses. This has been seen before. It is, I will say, truth in advertising, not seen in every study comparing loss and gain, but it is seen in some studies that it is more so for loss than gain. For gain than loss. Okay. Then what you can do is use those parameters from the model to actually do model-based imaging analyses to say what brain regions show activity that tracks with either the prediction error, or you can also do the expected value. And you can look at what brain regions show activity that modulates as a function of the trial-by-trial variability in prediction error. This is a little bit of a busy slide, so let me just orient you to it so you can see everything that's on there. So these are slices through the brain, starting from the top to the bottom. The regions in red are regions that show a positive modulation, meaning when prediction error goes up, they show increased activity. The regions in blue show a negative modulation, meaning when prediction error goes up, their activity tends to go down. And the ones in green show what we call a deactivation with a positive modulation, meaning they normally deactivate in response to engaging in a cognitive task. Like you see ventromedial prefrontal cortex here, and you see less of that deactivation when prediction error is high. Okay, so there are three types of regions that show different behaviors, right? So what do we see in folks with schizophrenia? Well, surprisingly, we see really intact tracking of striatal activity, really any of the brain regions that track prediction error in the striatum in patients with schizophrenia. And just to illustrate this, I'll plot out the time course of brain activity for 4 different kinds of trials here. So ACE positive is a trial where they chose an A and they got a positive outcome. So there you go. That's the black line there, okay? And the red line is BDF trials, so that's when you picked the thing that was less likely to be associated with reward and you get a positive response. And then the blue is when you chose the thing that's normally rewarded and you didn't get rewarded. And green is when you chose the thing not so likely to get rewarded and you didn't get rewarded. And what you can see here is that the patients and the controls both show greater activity when they get a positive outcome than a negative outcome. And it's somewhat more, okay, when it is an unexpected positive outcome, right? Now, I will say, when we saw this, we were surprised. This was not the result we were expecting. We thought for sure that we would see altered prediction error-related activity in the striatum because everybody said that's what we should see in folks with schizophrenia. This is a striatal disease. You should see altered striatal activity. And we just didn't see any evidence for this. So then we looked at other parts of the brain to say, well, what might else be going on? Oh, and this is just the modulation, which you can see is quite intact in the patients with schizophrenia. So we looked at other regions of the brain, and particularly we looked at regions of the brain that are thought to be involved in cognitive control and responding to errors. And we look in particular at what happens when the patients choose the wrong thing, right? So you choose the A stimulus, you should get rewarded most of the time. You choose the B stimulus, it shouldn't happen most of the time. Presumably you choose the B, you get negative feedback, you should have some brain responses that should be informative and help you learn not to choose that B stimulus so frequently. So what happens when you choose the B? Well, it turned out that what was happening in the patients is that in the controls, when they chose the B stimulus, they got increased activity in regions that were thought to respond to errors, that involve, kind of upregulating cognitive control. So we see parietal cortex, anterior PFC, dorsal anterior cingulate, even the thalamus. But the patients show significantly reduced activity in those regions, and they don't really discriminate between having gotten a positive or a negative response, right? The controls clearly show different activity when they get negative feedback in these cognitive control and error regions, and the patients were not showing such a discrimination there. And in fact, I always forget that I have arrows for you. In fact, when you look at what predicts performance, so here performance is defined by how much of the time are they choosing the stimulus more likely to be associated with reward, the A stimulus. What we see is what predicts activity there is the activation that you show to the B stimulus, not the activation to the A stimulus. So if you look in the anterior prefrontal cortex or the superior parietal lobule, regions that are thought to be important for exerting cognitive control, the degree to which you activate those regions when you get negative feedback predicts your ability to choose the right stimulus most of the time. So instead of it being the striatal activity associated with performance or the striatal activity being impaired in the patients, it was the activity more in cognitive control and error responsivity regions that was altered amongst the patients and predicting performance. So this was one study. We had a lot of debates with people in the literature about our results because they didn't fit the prevailing model. So we did another study using a different task. So here we borrowed a task and worked with Roshan Cools using a reversal learning task. Pretty simple task that she's used in a whole bunch of different studies. She's done a lot of work in Parkinson's disease with this. She's done it with PET imaging to look at dopamine. And it's very simple. They get pairs of stimuli. She uses fractals here that aren't very meaningful. And one of them is going to get rewarded more frequently than the other. It's also typically 80-20. And the job of the participant is to learn which one is more likely to be associated with reward. Once they've picked the correct stimulus a certain number of times, unbeknownst to them, we switch the probabilities, and now they have to learn to pick the other one more frequently. And you can look, if you wanted to, at different kinds of errors in this task. So you can look at what are called probabilistic errors, where the person is choosing essentially the right thing, but just by probability they get negative feedback on that trial. You can also look at reversal errors, where the underlying structure has reversed and the person hasn't figured it out yet. And you can also look at errors that precede evidence that they've actually updated their representation and made their reversal. I will say, as a spoiler alert, we did this task in part because there were some arguments in the literature that maybe there was something special about reversal learning in schizophrenia. I can tell you there is nothing special about reversal learning in schizophrenia. They have difficulties with the initial acquisition. If you create a version of the task that is matched for difficulty in controls between initial acquisition and reversal, because reversal is harder for everybody, but if you create a version that is matched on difficulty, then you see an overall impairment in patients with schizophrenia learning the acquisition and the reversal. You don't see any evidence of differential effects of reversal. You only see evidence for differential reversal effects if that's much harder for everybody. So it's kind of a psychometric problem.
Two quick questions.
Sure.
One, do you do multiple reversals or is it a single reversal?
Multiple reversals.
And how long is it between reversals relative to your probability of reward?
Okay, I'm trying to remember the rules. It's been a while. So it's you have to do the first reversal, you have to get 8 out of the 10 preceding trials correct, right? So it's like,
The one Angus uses.
yes, it's the same. And he created the version that was matched on, so we did that as part of our Centrix grant, where we created a new version that was matched. We made it easier so that the initial acquisition was 90-10, or sorry, the initial acquisition was 80-20, and then the reversal was 90-10, so it was more matched. And then we just see a flat main effect in patients that they're just bad at learning these things, right? Yeah.
Can I ask?
Sure.
So I actually don't understand the concept. Like you said that there was no differences with schizophrenia, but the difficulty of the task was a discriminant.
No. Sorry, I should have been clear. Patients are worse on this task, for sure. But there was 1 or 2 previous studies before we did this one of reversal learning that made a claim that they were differentially impaired at reversal, and therefore it implicated orbital frontal deficits, because if you look at the orbital frontal literature, there's an argument that they are impaired in animals that have lesions to orbital, blah, blah, blah. But the problem is that reversal is harder for everybody, even controls. So it takes people longer to relearn after reversal than after the initial discrimination. And we also know that it's easier to find group differences on tasks with greater variance, right? And typically more difficult is associated with greater variance. It definitely is here. So if you create a new version where the variance and difficulty are equal in healthy controls across initial discrimination and reversal learning, and now you look at patients are just bad. They're impaired on both, and they're not differentially impaired on reversal. So there doesn't seem anything special about relearning, right, or unlearning. It just is bad learning, bad explicit learning. Yeah, but they're definitely impaired, for sure. Yeah. Okay, but I say all this because when we originally did the study, we were interested in reversal learning before we figured out this issue. And this work was spearheaded by former grad student, now postdoc at Maryland, Adam Culbreth. So what do you see here? So we went and looked again for prediction error signaling in the striatum in patients with schizophrenia using model-based analyses. This was a Q-learning paradigm, a Q-learning model. And again, completely intact striatal prediction error learning in the patients. So here's the controls, here's the patients, just no difference whatsoever. Still, people didn't believe it, so we got another data set from Jim Waltz at Maryland, did the exact same type analyses, again saw intact striatal prediction error learning. So we're just not seeing any evidence that, brain activity in the patients is not tracking prediction error in any way, shape, or form. It seems to be tracking it just fine. It's true whether you do group-based analyses for the modeling. It's true when you model individual participants. It is certainly the case, and I think maybe Daniel alluded to this before, when you do these model-based analyses on an individual participant basis for imaging or for any purpose, you often find that there are a number of people who the model does not fit well, right? And so you may choose to exclude them because the model set, maybe they just have odd choice behavior and it doesn't fit well. And we sometimes see somewhat more patients with schizophrenia who are not fit well by the models, but it's not striking. So it's not, for example, that this looks really intact because we're just excluding all the patients who don't fit the model well, right? That doesn't seem to be the issue. And like I said, it's true. We see this whether we do group-based analyses, individual subject analyses, and so on. So again, if it's not the striatum, what is it? So Adam looked at activity and cognitive control in error regions. He looked in particular at activity when you kind of get feedback that you win versus feedback that you lose. And what he saw was disrupted activity in the anterior cingulate, dorsal parietal cortex, dorsal prefrontal cortex, the thalamus, the insula, the orbital frontal cortex. All of this showed reduced activity in the patients compared to the controls. And it was activity in these regions that predicted behavior and mediated the group effect, right? So the more you show disrupted activity in these brain regions among the patients, the worse your performance, not the striatal activity. That did not predict performance. And if you looked at a mediation model where you said, okay, what mediates between diagnosis and behavioral performance, it was brain activity in these cognitive control and error processing regions, not brain activity in the striatum that mediated that. So again, the modeling here helped us kind of hone in on the prediction error signaling and see that it actually seemed to be quite intact in the striatum, but where it was impaired was in these more cognitive control and error processing regions. Okay. All right. So if it's not the striatally mediated prediction error, Our data seem to suggest that it is more about cognitive control. And maybe this might reflect something about impairments, in particular what people have referred to as model-based learning in errors. We're big fans of reaching out to people who've developed these tasks and frameworks. So reached out to Nathan Daw at Princeton, who had developed this 2-step task to model model-based versus model-free learning, with the model-free learning being more what we mean by sort of this implicit striatally based learning, and model-based being more what we thought of as learning driven by explicit representations that are maintained in sort of frontal parietal control systems. If anybody has ever done any of Nathaniel's tasks before modification, you'll know they're horrific. Meaning that they're very complex and they use hard stimuli. And we really didn't think our patients could do it, but he had already been collaborating with Kate Hartley at NYU to create a child-friendly version of this with that had the same structure, so you could get at the same things and model it in the same way, but had a much better cover story and sort of a fun way of doing it. So it's called the Space Alien Task. And the participants are told that they're travelers in search of space treasure. So there's our space treasure. And they need to first pick a spaceship. So that's the first step. And that's going to take them to a planet, and they're going to get a pair of aliens, and they pick one of these aliens, and then that alien is or is not going to give them treasure. Okay, so picking the spaceship is the first step. Picking the alien is your second step, so 2-step task. And there's an underlying structure. So when you pick one of these spaceships, it leads with different probability to one planet versus the other. So this spaceship, 70% of the time takes you to the purple planet, and this spaceship, 70% of the time takes you to the red planet, right? And then the second stage choice here is probabilistically rewarded, and he fluctuates the payoff to kind of keep things interesting, okay? And so then what you do is you look at how frequently you repeat your stage 1 or state A choice as a function of whether you were rewarded or not on the previous trial, and as a function of whether when you picked this stage 1 choice, it took you to the frequent or common planet or the rare planet, right? And in particular, the argument is that if you're working on a model-free basis and all you're doing is sort of responding to what action was previously rewarded, if on the previous trial you picked this spaceship, you should pick this spaceship again, regardless of whether on the previous trial the spaceship took you to the planet it usually does. And if you're thinking about your model of this task, if it was going to the planet you usually went to, you're like, oh, that's a pretty good idea, I'll do it again. Maybe that alien will be there and he'll give me space gold again. But if on the previous trial it took you to the infrequent planet, right, maybe you should think twice about picking that same ship again, because it's not very likely to take you back to that red planet, since that's the unlikely planet, right? But if all you cared about was what action got rewarded, you'd choose this regardless of which planet it took you to the previous time. And if you model it, this is what the model says the data will look like, that you're much more likely to choose the same response again, which that he calls stay, if it was previously rewarded, and it doesn't matter whether it was a common transition on the previous trial or a rare transition, right? Because you're just going based on what action at stage 1 was associated with reward at stage 2. In contrast, right, if you're paying attention to the structure of the task and you have a model that you can represent and operate on, right, you'll still be more likely to choose that stage 1 response again, but it's going to be modulated now by whether it's a common transition or a rare transition, right? So if it was a common transition, yeah, do it again. You're likely to be able to pick that same space alien and get space treasure. But if it was a rare transition, you should recognize that it's much less likely that choosing that same spaceship will take you back to that same planet. And in fact, you should choose the other spaceship, because that spaceship is likely to take you to that other planet. So if you were being kind of completely model-based and ignoring the model-free component, the data should look more like this. And then what Nathaniel had seen in his original studies, if you run a bunch of Princeton undergraduates, the data looks pretty clearly like a combination of both model-free and model-based learning, right? So people are doing some of both. It doesn't look perfectly model-based or model-free. If you do computational modeling of this, there's this W parameter that you can pull out that kind of looks at the balance, and you see that they're doing some of both. They are balancing both, right? And there's individual differences that are interesting. All right, so we ran this task in patients with schizophrenia and healthy controls. So first, our healthy controls were not Princeton undergraduates, so we wanted to see what they did. And what you see here is they don't look model-free. They don't look perfectly model-based. They, in fact, look perfectly Princeton undergraduate, mixed model-based, model-free, right? So they're showing evidence of using both systems in their performance, okay? That's good. Then if you look, here's using hierarchical linear modeling, and this is statistically supported by seeing an interaction between the reward, whether you got rewarded on the previous trial and the rarity of the transition. So there's an interaction. What happens when we look at the patients with schizophrenia, though? Whoa, come on, there we go. Okay, so here's the choice behavior in the patients with schizophrenia. Looks a lot more model-free, not at all model-based, right? And much less like a combination compared to the DAW participants or to our healthy controls. So they look much more like they are using the model-free system, which is again consistent with our data suggesting intact implicit reinforcement learning, intact striatally mediated prediction error, but not much evidence that they're using a model-based system. And if you look at like John O'Doherty's work and other people's work, when they look at what's representing the model, it seems to be frontal parietal control systems that are representing the model and which code model-based errors. Statistically, this is supported by the fact that we see a nice main effective reward and no main effective rarity and no interaction. And if we put all the data in a model together between patients and controls, we see a three-way interaction between reward, rarity, and group because the controls show the interaction and the patients don't, okay? So more evidence that they're showing intact implicit, more evidence that they seem to be having problems learning when you should be able to use more explicit representations of things that allow you to learn. Just because I always like to show the same thing over and over again, we did yet another task to look at this, in case I have not yet convinced you of this. And this was a task that Jim Gold and Michael Frank had modified from stuff that Pasiglione had done, looking at learning from reward versus learning to avoid loss. Fairly simple study where all you have to do is you get pairs of stimuli, and we use these beautiful pictures, and you either had to choose which of these was going to be more likely to be rewarded, and so the outcome was either win, and you were going to get money, or not a winner, try again. And then you had other pairs where the choice was between losing money or getting to keep your money, right? So we had 4 pairs of trials. We also had a manipulation of whether it was an 80-20 or a 90-10, but I'm going to ignore that for now. So they had 4 pairs of stimuli, all intermixed, and they had to learn which was either more likely to be associated with winning versus not winning, and which was more likely to be associated with getting to keep your money versus losing, okay? And then, like that original Michael Frank task, after they did the whole learning phase, unbeknownst to them, there was now a test phase where we mixed up all the pairs, right? And we compared and we said, okay, pick which one, you think is more likely to be associated to have I think we used a more general term, have a better outcome. And you can look at things like, do they more likely choose items that were more frequently rewarded? Or do they choose items that help them avoid loss? And so you can again look at this learning from reward versus learning from loss. Okay, all right. Now we used a updated model that Michael and Jim had developed, but was now further updated by Michael's postdoc, Anhedonia, who did all this work. And the model was a model that combined an actor-critic architecture with a cue-learning architecture to try to kind of, again, get at this idea of a trade-off between learning through sort of, striatally mediated mechanisms versus learning through recruiting explicit representations that, Michael has argued in the past might be orbital frontal cortex. We've argued is dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but it is definitely thought to be a different learning system, right? And I put these details up here because everybody else had an equation and I wanted one too. But this way also, if anybody asks me questions, I've got the equations up here. So this is the actor-critic architecture, and then this was the cue-learning architecture. And then in Michael's framework, you can pull out different parameters that tell you something about what they think is happening in behavior. So one parameter that they have previously found to be important is something called the mix strategy. And it's how much of the performance is sort of accounted for by a cue learning strategy versus an actor-critic strategy. And so you mix them together and you get a hybrid value. We call it a mixing factor. And you can look at the value of this, right, with a higher value being associated with relatively more cue learning, which is the more explicit representation versus the actor-critic learning, and a low cue value being more actor-critic versus cue learning. Yeah. Did somebody have, yeah. Oh, 5 minutes. Okay, quick. And then there's some other parameters I'll tell you about in a minute. Okay, so what do we see in terms of performance? So here are the learning curves, just to kind of show you that learning is, worse in the. Now we have a big unmedicated sample. So unmedicated, medicated, and we added in bipolar folks. And if you just look at accuracy, you don't do any modeling. You just look at accuracy. All the patient groups are impaired, right? Bipolar, schizophrenia off medication, schizophrenia on medication, they all do worse than the healthy controls. Okay, maybe bipolars are impaired in the same way. But when you go and you look at the parameters, you start to see a somewhat interestingly different story. So if you first look at this mixing parameter, which is the weighting of the cue learning versus the actor-critic, we actually replicate what they had previously published in a different sample, which is that the patients off meds and on meds show a significant reduction in the mixing parameter compared to the healthy controls and its trend level compared to the bipolar patients, suggesting that they are using less of the cue learning, right, and relying more on the actor-critic learning, right? And where I think this is interesting is it now starts to pull apart the performance of the patients with schizophrenia from the performance of the patients with bipolar, who, when you just look at accuracy, don't look different, right? But when you look at what's going on, sort of when you model the data, right, it suggests that there's much more evidence in schizophrenia that reduced accuracy reflects a reduction in cue learning, right, relative to actor-critic learning. You can also look at these beta estimates, which are sensitivity to reward and consistent, somewhat consistent. You actually see somewhat of a reduction in the patients with psychosis on and off meds. This is what they call non-decision noise, which is sort of off-taskness. I'll think of it as attention lapses. That also seems to be more impaired in the patients. And if you look at memory decay, so this modeling is modeling the test phase as well as the training phase, so there is a memory component. And you see more evidence that the schizophrenia groups are having more of a decay in their memory representations for the pairings compared to the bipolar. So unlike just the kind of average performance measures, here you start to see differences between the bipolars and the schizophrenia patients that aren't easy to capture in the accuracy performance. And this is just showing you how well the model captures the behavior over time for each of the 4 groups. Okay. So I went a little longer than I thought. So I'll just skip over this part and tell you that we're now starting to look at how this relates to kind of concepts of expected value of control. So I've shown you that, they clearly show impairments in explicit reinforcement learning. We think this relates to cognitive control. There's a model by Amitai Shenhav who's talked about the dorsal anterior cingulate being important for helping you to determine sort of the expected value of cognitive control in a way that helps you determine how much effort you should allocate to an ongoing task given the likelihood perhaps that you think that increasing cognitive control is going to benefit you. And I'll just tell you as a spoiler alert, we see both for cognitive-based effort allocation and physical-based effort allocation that people with schizophrenia are less willing to exert effort when reward goes up or probability goes up. We see that if we use a discounting framework where we can look at subjective value estimates. We see that they discount subjective value more for more cognitively demanding tasks. We see that is true even if you account for performance. So it doesn't just seem to be that it is actually objectively harder for them. They seem perhaps to be overestimating, even given their cognitive impairments, the effort and discounting reward more if they have to exert effort to get that, either physical or cognitive effort. And that relates very nicely to multiple measures of clinical ratings of amotivation, ecological momentary assessments of their activities in daily life and how much they anticipate enjoying things and anticipating being pleasurable things. So we think that, if I had a whole nother 20 minutes, I can't make this go quicker. I'll just show you here. This is the subjective value curve. Discounting is a function of reward level. And we see that the patients discount, and particularly they discount at the easiest cognitive level. We've seen this at multiple tasks. And it relates really nicely to negative symptom ratings by clinicians, self-reports of motivation and pleasure impairments through ecological momentary assessment. We've seen that in multiple studies. We see it with cognitive effort. And then I'll just get to the end here. So what we think is going on is that it's not that patients don't enjoy things. It's not that they can't learn implicitly, but that they can't bring to bear, or they have a harder time bringing to bear, explicit representations that are maintained and used to exert cognitive control, that they have a hard time using those to sort of anticipate future positive outcomes and to extend behavioral action plans over an extended period of time, and that makes it harder for them to be willing to allocate the effort that would be needed to achieve those positive outcomes. And we think in particular that this leads to a particular plan of treatment, right, which is in some sense we need to figure out how we can provide sort of an external prefrontal cortex or cognitive control system to patients to help them bridge gaps in time, right, because in the moment they can enjoy things, right, but what they have a hard time doing is anticipating that future pleasure, generating an action plan, maintaining that action plan, and kind of keeping it going over time. I will say that we think that in depression, it's much more about the hedonics, which would lead to a very different approach to treatment than to sort of it being more about the ability to represent and use that information to guide future behavior. So I will stop there. Am I in time? Yeah. Okay, good.